The letter was sitting on my front porch, half buried under 3 inches of overnight snow, when I stepped outside at 7 in the morning to check my roof load gauge. I almost missed it entirely. I was wearing my heavy Carhartt jacket, my breath fogging up in the 20-degree air, boots crunching through the fresh powder on my steps, and I was already laser-focused on the gauge mounted to the side of my house because we'd had a brutal snowfall the night before, and I needed to know whether I was approaching dangerous territory on my roof. We're talking serious snow country here, not the fluffy, pretty Christmas card stuff. I mean the dense, wet, heavy, structural nightmare kind of snow that caves in roofs if you're not paying attention. I'd installed that gauge 3 winters ago after my neighbor 2 streets over lost his sunroom to a collapse. Smart investment. Probably saved me a couple of roof panels already. Anyway, I grabbed the letter on my way back inside, figuring it was a piece of junk mail that the carrier had stuck under the door awning before the snow started. I poured my coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it. It was from the Maple Crest Ridge Homeowners Association. Specifically, it was from Kathy Dennison, the HOA's Exterior Standards and Property Compliance Director, a title she had apparently invented for herself because nobody else in the neighborhood had ever heard it before she started putting it on her letterhead. I'd lived in Maple Crest Ridge for going on 11 years. I knew Kathy. Everybody knew Kathy. She was the kind of woman who measured your grass with an actual ruler, who photographed your recycling bins if they weren't pulled back from the curb by 8:15 on Thursday mornings, who had once filed a formal complaint against the Petersons' wreath because it was hung 7 inches off-center. If you were keeping score at home, Kathy Dennison was the human embodiment of everything people hate about HOAs, wrapped up in a puffy winter coat and armed with a clipboard. The letter read, in the most official and pompous language imaginable, that I had erected an unapproved exterior attachment on my home in violation of Maple Crest Ridge HOA Covenant Section 4, Paragraph 12, which governed all permanent and semi-permanent exterior modifications. The attachment in question was described as a vertical pole-like structure mounted to the exterior north-facing wall of my property, painted white, approximately 6 feet in height. I was informed that this structure had not been reviewed or approved by the HOA Architectural Review Committee, that it was in violation of the community's aesthetic standards, and that I had 14 days to remove it or face a fine of $150 per day until it was gone. I sat there for a second, coffee mug halfway to my mouth. She was talking about my snow load measuring pole. Now let me explain what that is for anyone who doesn't live in a place where 3 feet of snow in January is a perfectly normal thing. A roof snow load gauge is essentially a calibrated measuring stick mounted vertically on the exterior of your house, positioned so you can read how much snow has accumulated on your roof without actually having to climb up there in dangerous winter conditions. Mine was a simple, elegant piece of equipment. White PVC pole, 6 feet tall, mounted flush against the north wall of my garage with 2 stainless steel brackets. It had measurement markings on it in black, and it was designed to give me an accurate reading of roof snow depth, which I could cross-reference with a snow density chart to calculate approximate load per square foot. It was a safety device. A practical, boring, utterly inoffensive safety device that kept my roof intact and kept me from having to crawl around on an icy surface in sub-zero temperatures. And Kathy Dennison wanted me to take it down. I set my coffee mug down, took a breath, read the letter again, and then I did what any reasonable person does when they get a ridiculous HOA letter at 7 in the morning in the middle of winter. I laughed. Not a ha-ha that's funny laugh. More of a you've got to be kidding me laugh. The kind that's 90% disbelief and 10% the beginning of a plan. I called my buddy Dave Kessler, who lives 4 houses down and has been fighting with the HOA for years over his driveway basketball hoop. Dave picked up on the second ring, which told me he was already awake and probably also dealing with the snowfall situation. "You get a letter this morning?" I asked. "No, why? What they do?" "Kathy's going after my snow load gauge. Says it's an unapproved exterior attachment." There was a pause, then Dave started laughing too. "The measuring pole, the safety pole. She's going after that. 14 days or they start fining me $150 a day." "Ray," he said, and I could hear him getting his serious voice on, which usually meant something good was coming. "You know what you need to do, right?" "I'm already thinking about it," I said. I spent the rest of that morning doing two things. First, I shoveled my driveway because the overnight snow had left me with about a foot of accumulation, and my wife Linda needed to get her car out for work. That took me an hour and a half of hard work in temperatures that hadn't crawled above 22 degrees, and by the time I was done my back was reminding me that I was 53 years old and not 25. Then I came inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, and started reading. I mean really reading. I pulled up the Maplecrest Ridge HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions document, all 68 pages of it. I downloaded it years ago but never gotten deep into it, the way most people never read their phone's terms of service. Well, now I was reading it. It took me about 2 hours to get through the relevant sections. Section 4, paragraph 12 was indeed there, and it said what Kathy claimed it said, that all permanent or semi-permanent exterior modifications required prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. But I kept reading, because I'm the kind of guy who doesn't stop at the first thing that looks bad. And then I found it. Section 9, paragraph 3. Subparagraph C, it was a safety exemption clause. Right there in the document, buried between guidelines about fence heights and satellite dish placement. The clause specifically stated that no covenant restriction shall be interpreted to prevent a homeowner from installing, maintaining, or operating safety equipment required by applicable building codes, insurance standards, or recognized safety practices for the protection of life or property. The clause had been added years ago, probably after someone pointed out that you can't legally prevent people from installing smoke detectors or carbon monoxide alarms or handrails on their steps just because they don't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. My snow load gauge was safety equipment. Full stop. Its entire purpose was the protection of property, and arguably, given that a roof collapse could injure or kill someone inside the house, the protection of life as well. I printed out Section 9, Paragraph 3, Subparagraph C. I highlighted it in yellow. I also pulled up a document from the state's Department of Building Safety that listed snow load monitoring as a recommended safety practice for residential structures in my county, which was classified as a heavy snow load zone. I printed that too. Then I went online and looked up my homeowner's insurance policy. Right there in the policy documentation was a clause noting that my insurer encouraged snow load monitoring as part of a proactive roof maintenance program, and that documentation of such monitoring could be used in the event of a storm damage claim. By noon, I had a stack of printed documents on my kitchen table that was a solid inch thick. I also, on a whim, went outside and took photographs. Detailed photographs of the snow load gauge, showing exactly what it was, how it was mounted, how unobtrusive it was against the side of the garage, how it was painted white to blend with the wall, how there were no wires, no power sources, no moving parts, nothing that could reasonably be considered an aesthetic problem unless you were specifically looking for a problem. I took about 40 photos from various angles in the cold, my fingers going numb after the first 10 minutes. Then I went back inside and uploaded them all to my computer. I also, and this is important, I also emailed the HOA formally that same afternoon. Not a rambling, emotional email. A short, professional, calm email addressed to the full board, with Kathy Dennison in the CC field. I stated that I had received their notice, that I disputed the characterization of my roof snow load gauge as an unapproved exterior modification, and that I believed the installation was exempt from prior approval requirements under Section 9, Paragraph 3, subparagraph C of the community covenants. I attached the relevant covenant text, the state safety document, and 5 of the clearest photos of the gauge. I asked that the board review the matter and confirm within 5 business days that the notice was being withdrawn. I was polite. I was professional. I was not apologetic. Then I hit send and went to go deal with the ice that was forming on my back walkway. The response came faster than I expected. Within 2 hours, my email pinged. It was from Kathy Dennison personally, not the board, and it was not a withdrawal. Kathy's email was 2 paragraphs of barely concealed hostility wrapped in official-sounding language. She stated that Section 9, Paragraph 3 did not apply in my case because my gauge was not certified safety equipment as defined by any recognized regulatory body. That it was, in her words, a homemade apparatus of indeterminate purpose, and that the board fully supported the original notice. She also added, in what I'm sure she thought was a subtle dig, that the Maplecrest Ridge community had worked hard to maintain its aesthetic standards, and that the board expected all residents to respect that effort. Homemade apparatus of indeterminate purpose. My roof snow load gauge. A commercially manufactured, calibrated instrument with a product number, a manufacturer, and a user manual available as a PDF on the company's website. I called Dave again. She called it a homemade apparatus, I told him. You're kidding me. I have the purchase receipt. I have the box it came in. I have the instruction manual. Send all of it back, Dave said. Ray, start keeping a paper trail of everything. Every single communication. Print it, timestamp it, save it. Because you know Kathy, she doesn't stop. She doubles down. Dave knew from experience. His basketball hoop situation had dragged on for 8 months and had only ended when Dave showed up to a board meeting with a lawyer cousin in tow, at which point the board had suddenly discovered that portable basketball hoops were not actually covered by the exterior modification covenant at all. Funny how that works. The next few days were busy for everyone in the neighborhood because the weather had decided to pile on. We got another 8 inches Thursday night. The temperatures dropped to single digits by Friday morning, and the roads in our area were a mess. I spent about an hour each morning clearing my driveway and salting the walkway. My snow load gauge was reading at a level that had me monitoring things closely, not panic territory, yet but worth watching. The irony of the whole situation was not lost on me. The very device Kathy wanted removed was telling me every morning whether my roof was safe. And here I was, fighting an HOA battle while simultaneously trying to make sure my house didn't collapse under the weight of her metaphorical bureaucracy plus about 4,000 pounds of actual snow. I drafted a formal response letter, not an email this time, an actual letter mailed via certified mail with return receipt requested. In it, I provided the full product information for the gauge, including the manufacturer's name and contact information, the product model number, the retail price I had paid for it, and a copy of my purchase receipt. I quoted the specific safety exemption clause again. I referenced the state building safety document. I referenced my insurance policy. I also noted, politely but clearly, that I was aware that HOA enforcement decisions that went beyond the scope of the governing documents could constitute an overreach of authority, and that I was consulting with a real estate attorney familiar with HOA law in our state. That last part was a bit of a bluff in the sense that I hadn't actually hired an attorney yet, but I had called one. I'd spoken with a woman named Rebecca Cho who specialized in HOA disputes and had spent about 20 minutes on the phone with her explaining the situation. Rebecca's take was pretty simple. She said that if the covenants contained a safety equipment exemption, and if my gauge qualified as safety equipment under any reasonable interpretation, the HOA was going to have a very hard time enforcing this notice. She also said that HOA fines could be challenged in court, and that courts in our state had been increasingly skeptical of HOA overreach in recent years. She told me to document everything and that if they actually started fining me, to call her back and we'd talk about next steps. I thanked her, made a note of her number, and went back to my paper trail. Meanwhile, word had gotten out in the neighborhood. This is the thing about a tight-knit community. You can't sneeze without your neighbor noticing. And an HOA dispute involving something as obviously practical as a snow load gauge in the middle of a brutal winter was not the kind of thing people could stay quiet about. Linda mentioned it to a few people at the neighborhood's informal Friday night gathering that a few families had started doing in the Kesslers' finished basement because the weather was too bad to go out anywhere. Within about 20 minutes, the whole room knew. And the reaction was pretty much uniformly on my side. The Hensley family, Tom and Brenda, had been meaning to put up a similar gauge after reading about a roof collapse in the next county. The Garcias, who lived directly across from me, said they'd seen Kathy actually standing in the street in front of my house with a tape measure one afternoon, apparently measuring the height of the pole. Martin Chu, from 3 houses up, said he'd been meaning to say something to the board about Kathy's behavior for years, and that this was the last straw. Old Frank Petrakis from the corner house, who was 72 years old and had been in the neighborhood longer than anyone, just shook his head slowly and said, "That woman has been a problem since the day she joined that board." By the time I got home from that Friday gathering, I had commitments from 5 neighbors to submit formal letters to the HOA board expressing support for my position and concern about the enforcement action. Dave Kessler said he was going to contact the other board members directly, because not all of them were Kathy. There were 4 people on the board, and the other 3 were, as far as I knew, reasonable human beings who had been sort of bulldozed into passivity by Kathy's energy and organizational control. Saturday morning was brutal. 11 degrees when I woke up. The kind of cold where your car takes a full minute to decide if it wants to start. I checked my snow load gauge from inside the house using a simple trick I'd set up, a small camera mounted under the eave aimed at the gauge, connected to my home network. I could check it on my phone or laptop without going outside. The reading was manageable, but I was watching it. Ended up going out mid-morning to do some roof raking from the edge anyway, pulling snow down from the lower sections where I could reach. While I was out there, hood up, ice forming on my beard, who came walking up the street but Kathy Dennison herself, bundled in her signature red parka with the fur-trimmed hood, clipboard in hand like it was the middle of July and not 11 degrees. She stopped at the edge of my property line. I kept raking. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she had, the one that managed to sound both pleasant and threatening at the same time, "I see the structure is still there." "Good morning, Kathy," I said. I kept raking. "You have 8 days left before the fines begin." I paused, turned, looked at her. "I have a response letter in the mail to the board, certified return receipt. You should have it by Monday." "I'm aware of your position," she said. "The board has discussed it and we're not persuaded." "When did the board discuss it?" I asked. "Because I didn't receive any notice of a board meeting." She blinked. "Just slightly. We had an informal discussion." "An informal discussion isn't a board vote, Kathy. Under our governing documents, enforcement actions have to be approved by a majority vote at a properly noticed board meeting. Has that vote happened?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The board is in agreement." "I'll be following up on that," I said pleasantly. I turned back to my roof raking. "Have a great Saturday." I heard her footsteps crunch away on the snow-covered sidewalk, and I exhaled slowly, my breath making a big cloud in the frozen air. That had gone well. I got back inside and pulled up the governing documents again. I was right. Section 11 of the covenants laid out the enforcement procedure. A formal notice of violation required a vote of the majority of the board at a duly noticed meeting. Homeowners had the right to be notified of the meeting and to speak at it before any enforcement action was finalized. The notice Kathy had sent me had not referenced any board vote. Her email had not referenced any board vote. It was entirely possible that Kathy had sent that notice unilaterally on her own authority without a proper vote, which would mean the notice itself was procedurally invalid. I added this to my folder. Monday came, and with it two things. More snow, another 6 inches overnight that had me out clearing my driveway before 7 in the morning, and a certified mail receipt confirmation showing that the HOA had received my letter. I also sent individual emails to the 3 other board members, Marcus Webb, Janet Hopper, and Dale Strickland, asking them to confirm whether a formal board vote had been taken regarding the enforcement action against me. I was polite, I was specific, and I asked for a response within 3 business days. Marcus Webb responded within 2 hours. He said he had voted in favor of the action based on information Kathy had presented. I asked him what information. He said she had described the structure as an unauthorized metal antenna. I told him via reply calmly that it was not an antenna. It was a commercially manufactured roof snow load gauge, and I attached the product information again. I also attached the safety exemption clause. Marcus went quiet after that. Janet Hopper replied the same afternoon. She said she hadn't fully reviewed the details and asked if I could send her the relevant documentation. I sent everything, all of it. The covenant clause, the product details, the state safety document, the insurance policy reference, the photos. Janet's reply came back within an hour, and it was 3 words. I see the issue. Which I took as a good sign. Dale Strickland didn't respond directly, but Dave Kessler told me he'd run into Dale at the gas station that afternoon, and Dale had said that he thought the whole thing had gotten out of hand, and that he wasn't sure the board should be pursuing it. The 5 neighbor support letters went into the mail that Monday as well, and 2 of them also sent emails directly to the board. Tom Hensley's letter was particularly good. Tom was a structural engineer, and he wrote 3 paragraphs about the physics of roof snow loading, the importance of monitoring, and the fact that unmonitored snow accumulation was a genuine hazard in our area. He included references to regional building codes. It read like something you'd file in a court case. I made a copy for my folder. Tuesday evening I got a call from Marcus Webb, not an email, an actual phone call. "Ray," he said, and he sounded uncomfortable, "I've been reviewing the documentation you sent, and I talked to Janet and Dale this afternoon. We're having some concerns about this enforcement action." "I appreciate that, Marcus," I said. "I want you to know that when Kathy brought this to us, she described it differently than it actually is. She said you had some kind of unauthorized structure, didn't really specify what it was. None of us went out to look at it. So there was no proper vote with full information," I said. He paused. "That's a fair characterization. And no homeowner notice of a meeting." Another pause. "Also fair. Marcus, I'm not trying to make this into a war," I said, and I meant it. "I have a safety device on my house that keeps my roof from collapsing. It's protected under our own covenants. I want this notice withdrawn, and I want to know that the process is going to be followed correctly going forward." He said he'd talk to the other board members and get back to me. The next day the snow finally let up. Not warm, still in the mid-20s, but at least nothing new falling. My gauge reading had stabilized at a level I felt good about, so I could stop worrying about my roof for the moment and focus on the HOA situation. Wednesday afternoon brought something I wasn't expecting. My doorbell camera pinged, and I checked it on my phone to see Kathy Dennison walking up my front path, not with her usual clipboard this time. She wasn't wearing the official red parka. She was in a regular winter coat, and she looked different, less official. More like someone who knew she'd overplayed her hand. I went to the door and opened it before she could ring the bell. "Kathy," I said. She stood there for a moment in the cold, her cheeks red from the temperature, vapor rising from her breath. "Ray, I was hoping we could talk." "Sure," I said. I did not invite her inside. It was cold, and I was curious where this was going, but I wasn't going to make her comfortable enough to draw it out. "I may have been hasty with the notice," she said, and those words clearly cost her something. Kathy Dennison did not do acknowledgments of fault easily. "May have been," I said. The other board members have raised some concerns about the process. She shifted her weight. And the documentation you provided about the safety exemption is, I'll admit, relevant. So the notice is being withdrawn. She took a breath. I'd like to discuss a resolution. What's there to discuss? My gauge is covered by Section 9, Paragraph 3, Subparagraph C. The enforcement notice was procedurally improper because there was no properly noticed board meeting with homeowner opportunity to be heard. The description of my gauge to the other board members was inaccurate. The notice should be withdrawn, and there should be a written confirmation that no fines will be levied. She stared at me. I think she'd expected more negotiation on my part, some give and take, an opportunity to declare a partial victory. I'll bring it to the board, she said. Please do. I'll be at the next formal board meeting. She left. I watched her walk back down the snow-dusted path and out to the street, and I closed the door, went back to my kitchen table and updated my notes. Things moved quickly after that. Marcus Webb called Thursday morning to say that the 3 other board members were in agreement that the notice should be withdrawn, and that they'd be scheduling a formal meeting for the following Tuesday to vote on it officially, and to review the enforcement procedures that had led to the situation. He said Kathy was not in agreement but was outvoted. I thanked him and asked him to make sure homeowner notice went out for the meeting, which it did. A single-page notice was distributed to all residents the next day. That Tuesday meeting was something I won't forget easily. The community room at the Maplecrest Ridge Clubhouse seated about 40 people comfortably. When I walked in, there were at least 60 people there, some sitting on the floor along the back wall. It was standing room only for a HOA board meeting in January, which almost never happens. Dave was there with his wife Carol. Tom and Brenda Hensley were there. The Garcias came. Frank Petrakis was there in his heavy wool coat. People I barely knew from the far end of the development were there. The 5 families who'd written support letters were all there. There were people I'd never seen at an HOA meeting in 11 years. Kathy was sitting at the board table at the front of the room, and I could see from her posture that she had counted the crowd and understood what she was looking at. Marcus called the meeting to order. He explained the agenda item, which was the formal review and withdrawal of the enforcement notice issued to me regarding my roof snow load gauge. He summarized the key points. He was fair and accurate and didn't editorialize. Janet Hopper nodded along. Dale Strickland was looking at the table. Then the floor was opened for homeowner comments. Tom Hensley went first and delivered a concise, professional summary of why snow load monitoring was essential safety practice in a heavy snow load zone. He was calm and authoritative and referenced specific numbers. He'd printed handouts. 60 people in a cold room in January took Tom Hensley's handouts and read them. Frank Petrakis stood up and said, slowly and clearly, that he had been in this neighborhood for 26 years, and that the board's job was to protect the community, not to hassle people over safety equipment. He got a round of applause. A woman I'd met maybe twice, Sandra Worthington from the cul-de-sac at the north end, stood up and said she'd ordered a snow load gauge of her own after hearing about my situation and that she'd like to know whether she was also going to be getting a violation notice. She got a laugh from the crowd. Kathy's jaw tightened. Several more people spoke. They were uniformly supportive. Nobody spoke in favor of the enforcement action. Not one person. When the public comment period ended, Marcus called the vote. The withdrawal of the enforcement notice passed 3-1. Dale abstained, which was essentially the same as a yes. Kathy voted no. The vote was recorded in the minutes. Then Marcus raised the second agenda item, which was a review of enforcement procedures. He proposed that going forward, all enforcement notices had to be approved by a full board vote at a noticed meeting before being issued, that homeowners would have the opportunity to present evidence prior to any vote, and that board members would be required to independently verify the nature of any alleged violation before voting. This passed 3-1 as well. After the meeting, I stood around for a while talking to neighbors. It was a cold night, but nobody seemed to be in a rush to leave. There was a lot of energy in the room. People had things to say to each other. A few families were talking about organizing a community snow-clearing crew for the elderly and single-parent households on the street. Martin Chu said he was going to look into formally running for the HOA board in the spring election, and about 8 people immediately told him he had their vote. Kathy left quickly. I saw her go, bundled back into her red parka, not making eye contact with anyone. I didn't feel triumphant about that exactly. It was more of a quiet, tired satisfaction. The kind you feel when something that was wrong gets corrected through the right process. I got the formal written confirmation of the notice withdrawal in the mail 2 days later. Marcus had signed it. I added it to my folder. Then I called Rebecca Cho to let her know the situation had been resolved and I wouldn't be needing her services, though I kept her number in my phone because you never know. The weather continued being the weather. We got more snow the following weekend, another 5 inches, but by then I was back to simply dealing with it like a normal person. I checked my gauge every morning, shoveled when I needed to, salted the walkway, kept my roof clear with the rake when things got high. The gauge stood on its brackets against the north wall of my garage, exactly as it always had, white pole against white wall, doing its quiet, important job. About a week after the board meeting, something interesting happened that I hadn't anticipated. My next-door neighbor on the east side, a quiet guy named Phil Dorsey who I'd always gotten along with but who'd never been particularly involved in neighborhood stuff, knocked on my door one afternoon. Phil was around 40, worked from home, generally kept to himself. He was holding something when I opened the door. It was an envelope. "Hey Ray," he said, "I wasn't sure whether to bring this to you or just tell you about it, but I think you need to see it." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a copy of an email that had been forwarded to him by another neighbor. It was from Kathy Dennison, sent to a group of people I didn't recognize. The email had been sent about a week before the board meeting, and it was not the kind of email you'd want to see if you were Kathy. In the email, Kathy had written that she was trying to, and I'm going to quote this accurately, build a majority to push through a vote before the Hendricks thing gets out of hand. She described me as a problem homeowner who had been difficult in the past and who she wanted to see sanctioned as an example to others. She said that she had already been in communication with a landscaping company that she preferred for community contract work, and that her support for their upcoming contract renewal was contingent on a couple of board members seeing things her way on a few pending issues. She didn't spell it out more explicitly than that, but the implication was pretty clear. Kathy was linking her enforcement actions and her board votes to her own preferences on vendor contracts. I read it twice. Sat down. Read it again. If the landscaping contract thing was what it looked like, that was not just HOA overreach. That was something potentially a lot more serious. Depending on how the contract worked and what exactly she'd done, using board authority to steer vendor contracts in exchange for personal or political considerations, could cross into territory that HOA attorneys would describe with words like misappropriation, breach of fiduciary duty, or fraud. I called Rebecca Cho the next morning. Rebecca listened to me describe the email, asked several clarifying questions, and then went quiet for a moment. "Ray," she said, "I need you to get me a copy of that email and all related documentation, and I need you to not do anything else with it until we've talked through the implications." "How serious is this?" "It depends on the specifics," she said carefully. "But steering HOA contracts in exchange for votes, if that's what happened, is a significant breach of fiduciary duty at minimum. If HOA funds were involved, it could be criminal. I need to see the full picture." I arranged a meeting with Rebecca the following day. Phil Dorsey agreed to come along since he was the one who'd received the email. He brought his phone, which had the original forwarded email with full headers intact showing the send date and recipients. Rebecca reviewed everything carefully. Then she asked Phil how he'd come to receive the email. Phil explained that he'd been forwarded it by someone who'd received it from Kathy, apparently by mistake. Kathy had intended it for a different group of contacts. The person who'd forwarded it to Phil had gotten cold feet about being involved in whatever Kathy was organizing and had sent it along without identifying themselves. Rebecca explained that we should notify the HOA board formally of the email's existence and its implications. She also recommended contacting the HOA's management company, which was a third-party firm called Pinnacle Community Management that handled the financial side of things, including contract disbursements. If Kathy had been influencing contracts inappropriately, there would be a financial paper trail that Pinnacle would have access to. We submitted a formal written complaint to the HOA board and to Pinnacle the following week. Rebecca drafted the letter, which was meticulous and cited specific legal standards. The letter requested that Pinnacle freeze any pending contract renewals pending review, and that the board conduct an independent audit of recent vendor contracts with board member conflicts of interest. The board, meaning Marcus, Janet, and Dale, took it seriously. I think they'd been a little uneasy about Kathy for a while, and this gave them the cover they needed to act. Pinnacle was also motivated to cooperate because the last thing a management company wants is to be implicated in a client board's fiduciary misconduct. Within 10 days, Pinnacle had flagged 2 irregularities in recent landscaping contract bids. The winning bids had both gone to the same company under circumstances that didn't fully align with the competitive bidding requirements in the HOA's own bylaws. Both bids were for contracts that had been approved by a 4-0 board vote, but in both cases, the board minutes showed that Kathy had presented the bids and advocated for the specific vendor, and documentation of the competitive process was thin. Pinnacle referred the matter to their legal counsel. Rebecca filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA regulatory office, and at that point things moved into territory that was out of my hands in the best possible way. The state sent an investigator in early February, a quiet, businesslike woman who met with the board members individually, reviewed financial records, and interviewed homeowners. I gave a statement. Phil gave a statement. Several other neighbors gave statements about patterns they'd observed in Kathy's board behavior over the years. Things that individually might have seemed like just her being overbearing, but in context started to look like a consistent pattern of using board authority for personal advantage. The investigation took about 6 weeks. I wasn't kept fully in the loop because most of it wasn't my direct business. But at the end of those 6 weeks, the state regulatory office issued findings that included a requirement for the HOA to reprocure the 2 landscaping contracts through a proper competitive process, a requirement for mandatory HOA board governance training, and a referral to the county district attorney's office based on evidence of financial misconduct. The DA's office took it from there. Kathy Dennison was charged with 2 counts of breach of fiduciary duty and 1 count of misappropriation of association funds, based on evidence that she had received a personal benefit, apparently a significant discount on privately contracted landscaping services for her own property, in connection with her steering of the HOA contracts. She retained a lawyer. There was a process. It took time, as these things do. In the end, Kathy entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge, paid restitution to the HOA for the financial harm caused, and was permanently removed from the board as part of the agreement. She avoided jail time, which was probably the right outcome given the scale of things, but she lost her board seat, paid real money, and had a conviction on record. The days of Kathy Dennison wandering the neighborhood with a clipboard and a tape measure, handing out violation notices like Halloween candy, were over. The spring board elections were genuinely competitive for the first time in years. Martin Chu ran and won. Sandra Worthington ran and won. Marcus Webb ran for re-election and won fairly, because he'd handled the crisis well and people respected that. The new board met in March and spent its first 3 meetings reviewing and updating the enforcement procedures, establishing a proper competitive bidding process for all contracts, and creating a homeowner liaison committee that would review any enforcement disputes before they went to a formal notice. Tom Hensley volunteered for that committee. So did Frank Petrakis. It was a genuinely better HOA than it had been the previous January, and all of it started with a letter about a snow pole. My snow load gauge is still there. Same brackets, same white PVC pole, same calibration markings. It got me through the rest of what turned out to be a genuinely brutal winter. We had a stretch in late February where my roof was carrying more weight than I was comfortable with, and I was out there at 6 in the morning with the roof rake, pulling snow down in the dark while the temperature hovered at 8 degrees. Without that gauge, I'd have been going by feel, by guesswork. Because of the gauge, I had actual numbers. I knew when to act and when I could wait. My roof made it through the season without a problem. Spring came eventually, the way it always does up here, slowly and uncertainly. Cold rain mixed with the last dirty snow, gutters running fast with melt water, mud season making the roads look like something from a nature documentary. I watched the measurement markings on my gauge go down week by week as the snowpack shrank. By the middle of April, the reading was 0. Clean roof, warm sun, birds back in the yard. Linda and I sat on the porch that first genuinely warm Saturday in May. The neighborhood looked good. Green coming back to the lawns. People out walking dogs, kids riding bikes on streets that had been buried in white just a few months ago. Dave Kessler waved from the end of his driveway. The Garcias were planting something in their front bed. Frank Petrakis was moving at his characteristic slow, deliberate pace down the sidewalk, jacket open for the first time since October. "You going to take the gauge down for the summer?" Linda asked. "No reason to," I said. "It's not hurting anything," she laughed. "No, I guess not." "Besides," I said, and I was half joking but also kind of not, "if I leave it up it might bother someone." She gave me a look. "Ray, what? It's a legitimate safety device. The covenants say so." She shook her head, smiling. We sat there for a while in the afternoon sun, which felt more valuable than gold after the winter we'd been through. The neighborhood was quiet in the good way, the way it is when things are running right, when people are just living their lives without someone making it complicated. I thought about Kathy Dennison briefly. Not with anger, by then the anger had burned off a long time ago. More with something like sadness, maybe. Because whatever motivated her to run her little HOA empire the way she did, whatever made her feel like she needed to control everything and everyone and turn a community of neighbors into a fiefdom, that was a pretty miserable way to live. And in the end, she'd been the author of her own problems. Not because anyone had set out to get her. Just because she'd pushed too hard against something that was clearly right, and the truth had come out, the way it tends to do. The snow load gauge caught the afternoon sun, and the markings on it were bright and clear. I hoped the next winter would be milder, but if it wasn't, I was ready. I had my gauge, I had my roof rake, I had a freshly installed bag of roof melt strips in the garage, and I had a neighborhood full of people who'd gone through something together and come out the other side with a better community than they'd started with. The polls stayed up. The HOA learned a lesson. And as far as I was concerned, that was a pretty good outcome for everyone involved, except maybe for the one person who'd started the whole thing with a letter about an unapproved exterior attachment. Every time I looked at that gauge, I didn't see a legal battle or a violation notice or a 3-ring binder full of highlighted covenant clauses. I just saw a white pole that told me my roof was safe, which was all it had ever been. And honestly, that was the whole point all along.